Hey, we should come up with like a book club jingle or something.
Like a certain intro for
Yeah, like book club. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. I think we three could come up with something really really fun.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the hook!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
I got really funny feedback, Joe. People liked the big boys with big feelings.
Today we're little white boys with little white feelings.
Oh,
Affirmative
no.
action. Ready to go with the book?
Yeah.
Sweet. So, welcome to Propaganda Loves You. My name is Joe. I'm joined by Kodie and Arthur. We are talking about our second book of book club. This is When Affirmative Action Was White, Ira Katznelson. The subtitle is An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America. A little background on the book. The writer, Ira Katznelson, is a political scientist. He is the Ruggles Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. A quick explanation about professors and ranks in the university. When you are on the tenure track, which means you have job security as a professor, there are ranks. You start as an assistant professor, you get promoted with tenure to associate professor. From there, you can be promoted to full professor. And once you're a full professor, there are opportunities selectively to become a named chair. So universities have these special endowments for specific professor roles. So when someone is a full professor, associate professor, assistant professor, they're the Ruggles professor, or there's some name before their professorship. That means that they have the rank even higher than full professor, which is as high as you can go. So Katznelson has climbed the full ladder of academia. He's at the top of his field, really well-known political scientist. And yeah, Arthur, thanks for picking this book. This is a great read so far. I'm really enjoying it. One word about Columbia University, since that's where he teaches. You may have seen Columbia University in the news recently with some of the ICE kidnappings of Palestinian solidarity protesters and things like that. Last night at the event I went to, the author actually talked about what Columbia University did during the pro-Palestine encampments. In 1968, there was a famous encampment that took place at Columbia, and they had a whole history of that encampment and protest effort on their website, and they're very proud of that history as a university. When the pro-Palestine encampment started at Columbia, they took that history off their website. They hid it because the hypocrisy was obvious, because they were cracking down so hard on their current students while also bragging about their students from the 60s who had done the same thing. So universities are strange places. You can have really good professors doing great work at universities who themselves are kind of repressive and doing shady things. And there's a lot of tension institutionally between the people who work there and the institutions themselves. So just a little context on that. The book itself is about federal programs in the New Deal era after the Great Depression and how they were intentionally manipulated by all politicians, but especially Southern Democrats, who particularly benefit white people when their stated intention was to benefit Black people to correct disparities in the social structure. I just wanted to read one of the blurbs. If you kind of flip through the book and look at the stuff before the book actually starts, you see these quotes from people who reviewed it, and you can look at some of the names to get a sense of what people are thinking about the book. Of course, this is a performative thing the book does. Look how great this book is you're about to read. Look at all these people who love this book already. But it's a very common thing in the book industry to get your book blurbed, and the more blurbs you get, the more impressive your book looks. So Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is a famous historian and literary critic, he's had a program on PBS called, I think, Finding Your Roots. Yeah, Finding Your Roots, Henry Louis Gates Jr. host. And he would find people's ancestries who had come over and gone through Ellis Island and things like that, and would sort of connect them with their ancestry in interesting ways. So that guy, Henry Louis Gates Jr., has a blurb in one of the pages preceding the book, and he says, When Affirmative Action Was White, the name of this book, shows the economic disparities between white and Black America were deliberately created during the New Deal and reveals how the policies that created these divisions remained in place for nearly 50 years. Ira Katznelson's explosive analysis provides us with a new and painful understanding of how politics and race intersect, and will force everyone, students, teachers, and general readers alike, to reinterpret 20th century economic and social history in a completely new way. So just as an intro to the book, a little bit about that, I wanted to throw it to you, Arthur, in case there's anything you want to say about your experience with the author or anything about the book you wanted to mention before we jump into some of the content.
Yeah, I originally got introduced to Ira Katznelson when I was at University of Oregon studying political science, and it was in a racial political science course, and one of the teacher kind of went into, it was all about like Southern Democrats and George Wallace and the rise of kind of what today's subsect of, Republicans is, Tea Party and Democrats as well, and Dixiecrats and how they got there. And this, obviously is part of that journey. I think it's super interesting because, the New Deal in response to the Great Depression, it's kind of told, like we talk a lot about mythology and having kind of like the prophet figure. The New Deal is told to be kind of like this. Obviously it's like heroic. It's FDR, response to the Great Depression, and it provided immediate relief and recovery, and it allowed Americans to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, as we're told. And so uncovering it and reading about the actual stuff that was going on at the time, it's just super interesting to get into the gritty details of politics at the time and how it plays out today.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I think the more I'm having this experience too in a lot of different topics and a lot of different things, but the more we dig into what actually went on in the past, the more we learn that progress is definitely not a straight line. It's not some perfectly upward trend. There's a little bit of progress forward, and then people who view that progress as a loss will fight tooth and nail to take that progress back. So we see a lot of steps forward, steps back, step forward, step back. And this is kind of how social justice happens. So once we think, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. One of the things I learned last night is that when that act was signed, I think in 1990, it brought employment of people with disabilities up to, I'm going to forget the specific number, but I think it's like 30% after that bill was signed. People with, they 30%. No, I'm sorry, I'm getting backwards, sorry. It's the unemployment number. That unemployment number got reduced down to like 19% or something with people with disabilities. Now, even though the act is still in place, the unemployment number is back up to like 30%. So the law is passed, the structure's there, but a lot of that progress has been taken away. And you can use the courts and subtle little manipulations of different laws to make that happen if you're a person with power. And so we kind of see how the sausage gets made is one way to think about it in this book. How those powerful people in government kind of manipulate things in subtle ways to claw back some of that progress. To start with, I had a couple of quotes from the introduction I wanted to read to get us going, but before that, I thought we could just talk for a minute about this term affirmative action. You guys, we've all read some of this book already, but sort of bracketing the things you've learned, what would you say is your general understanding when you hear that term affirmative action? What's the meaning you take away from it? What do you think about it?
I guess I think of governmental policies that try to, it's really hard to word this. Okay, I think of it as governmental policies that try to correct historical discrimination.
I was trying to think like if my understanding or interpretation of affirmative action has changed since I started reading this book or not. I don't know if I've got an answer to that yet, but the thing that I think, at least since I was 16, that I always think of when I hear affirmative action is the scene from American History X when Edward Norton is sitting at the table with his dad and they're talking about affirmative action, and he calls it affirmative black action, like Edward Norton's dad does in that scenario. I mean, great movie, great message that the movie has all at the end and everything like that. But that scene specifically, I think that was my first actual interaction with the term affirmative action and like my first experience in that conversation, I guess. Yeah, I think I agree with Arthur. Like, as I grew up, and my overall interpretation is it's, I guess, would be like government policy to correct a discrimination is generally what I think of nowadays. But
Yeah, that's what I think we're taught to believe.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, totally. I think that's the general understanding. It has to do with the government policy, and the intention of that government policy is to specifically help Black people. I think that's the cultural assumption about affirmative actions. It has to do with Blackness, and that's what the movie scene you're talking about signals to. Like in white culture, especially, if you see like politics of resentment taking place, you see a lot of saltiness that sometimes gets displayed about this. Like, oh, they got affirmative action, you know. But I think just even breaking down the word itself, what does it mean to affirm something? So the affirmation, if I want to live as my higher self, I'm going to do my affirmations. I'm going to tell myself the stories about myself that make me a better person, and I'm going to affirm that reality for myself. And so the intention here, affirmative action, is to affirm an equality we aspire to through government action, right? We're trying to affirm the equality of white and Black people through government action. And that's, I think, the intention of the original law, the intention of what's going on here. And what's so interesting about what Ira Katznelson is doing is to point out how, yes, it started with that and immediately got manipulated and turned around and actually goes in the opposite direction, which is crazy. So one of the quotes from the preface I wanted to point out, it's on page 11 or XI, because the preface doesn't do the regular numbers yet. So page XI. That middle paragraph there, he's doing a similar thing that Howard Zinn did in People's History of the United States, where he's sort of stating his perspective. And I thought that was interesting. I remark on these conflicting understandings and patterns. He's talking about affirmative action. But this commentary neither is my main theme nor my central purpose. Writing as a historian, I want to set the record straight. As a political scientist, I would like to understand the mechanisms that produced these outcomes. As a citizen, I wish to present these understandings in order to alter our misconceptions and reposition the direction of how we think, talk, and act about affirmative action. Rather than limit attention to successful programs that have made our elite institutions more racially integrated, I propose that affirmative action focus on antidotes to specific harms that date back to national policies in the 1930s and 40s as remedies for deep, even chronic dispossession that continues to afflict a large percentage of Black America. And so, yeah, his point there is like, yeah, we've made some progress with this, but there are really, really specific things that are still bad that have not been addressed. And his purpose here, and he's pointing out all these, I don't know, what do you guys think about this perspective narrating he's doing? How do you feel as readers when you hear him point out these different perspectives? Does it reassure you in some way? Does it confuse? What does that do for you?
I think it builds a lot of trust. I just feel like I can trust him because he's just being like, he's just wearing it on his sleeve and he's just taking it from multiple angles. And that's the best.
I did want to comment. That's something that I wanted to talk about because I was thinking about your comment the other day about that and kind of how he explains not only the angle that he's coming at, but I think right in this same area, he talks about all the other work in that same field and talks about how that plays with this, but why this one's a little bit different. I think it might be a little bit later on, but yeah, it definitely gives me way more confidence in reading this that I understand the message that they're trying to get across, and it's less like trying to interpret the message through the writing. Well, I mean, there's still that part of it, but you already understand what they're trying to get across to you before you even start the book. So yeah, definitely really, really good to read that beforehand, I think.
Last thing I wanted to talk about for the preface is just to kind of highlight this part where he's justifying his subtitle. So again, his subtitle for this book is An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America. And on page 15 of the preface, the last page of the preface, third to last paragraph, he says, notwithstanding my subtitle holds, despite the work of leading scholars, the American public remains in the dark about the moment not very long ago when affirmative action was white. I mean untold history in the sense of a not fully conveyed or altogether disclosed story, one that comes into full view only when its parts are considered together. The various elements of mid-20th century public policy that advantaged whites have been thought about in the main at one at a time rather than in a single, if complex, configuration. Moreover, these histories, even when thought to be germane to current issues, have only been loosely connected to present reflections and disputes. I thought that kind of tied in nicely to our conversations about history and what it means to do history as a story, as sort of weaving the narrative together, not just little bits of data. Any thoughts you guys have about that or his argument in general leading up to the book?
I was trying to research what kind of one of the main things that he talks about is how it is untold and how it's not connected to today's scape of what we view. And so I actually looked into this a little bit, and I found that I was not aware of this stuff either. So I looked into other modern bills that were kind of doing the exact same thing that he kind of says here, where we're not talking about the negative effects, because I think sometimes these things get thrown up in the media as positive. Bill comes forward like the CARES Act of 2020, where we all got stimulus checks for a while, okay? And I looked into it, and 5.1 million U.S. citizens were denied payments because they lived in a, quote, mixed status household of migration. So it's like, it's just kind of like these things that get passed through and we're told everybody's getting money, but actually people who are paying taxes are excluded from these exact governmental policies that are meant to provide aid to everybody.
You could,
I don't know. And then I looked into,
I was just going to say that made me think of like maybe another example that people could relate to, but like the PPP loans, like for during COVID, that were originally for like small business and like trying to keep people afloat and keep people employed in these small businesses by, you know, giving them money, and how abused that was, and how like larger businesses just basically ripped off like a ton, like millions and well, probably billions of dollars, right? But yeah, same thing there, right? Like it's this great, you know, help, and yet actual in practice, right? Like what actually occurred there versus what is being, or what it was originally intended or stated for, right?
Yeah, so it's like when he says the present reflections, disputes, it's also like, you know, a main part of the prologue too is where he's talking about how affirmative action, in a way, it's not new. It's kind of already something that's been around for white Americans at the time, that they could have access to some of these programs. And if you trace that to today's wealth, you know, white people were able to build generational wealth, and Black people currently have, in terms of generational wealth, like 1/10 that of white Americans. And it's directly tied to exactly what the government did in the 30s and 40s.
That immediately makes me want to jump to chapter 2 to talk about generational wealth.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, but like it's a great comment, because it's true. Like white people have a hard time, and I'm speaking to myself as much as anybody else, but we have a hard time acknowledging our privilege sometimes. And because life is hard for everyone, we assume that because life is hard for us, that means we don't have privilege. But it's important to consider other people's experiences and their generational experiences, to consider who their parents were, who their grandparents were, what their conditions were like, and to recognize from the other book I read earlier that we're all standing on the shoulders of somebody. Like we come from a certain context, from a certain place, and that context and place matters, you know, even in the society we have now. Just walking around in the world as white guys confers a certain safety other people who don't fit that description don't have. And we can take those comforts for granted in a lot of ways. All right. Chapter 1, this book, does a couple of things that I think are important. First of all, he kind of goes into a little more detail about what he's trying to do in this book. He gives us a little bit bigger of an outline of his goal in this book, which I'm going to talk about. But the chapter itself is also kind of an argument and a commentary about this speech that Lyndon B. Johnson delivered at Howard University commencement, I think, in 1965. LBJ gave this speech at Howard University in 1965, height of the Civil Rights Movement, and the name of the speech is "To Fulfill These Rights." So it has to do with this idea of affirming to the Black community that there is equality in this country. You know, I'm the commander-in-chief. I'm going to make sure it happens, all this kind of stuff. So he's sort of commenting on that speech that LBJ gave and doing a little bit of history about it, especially as LBJ as a politician. He mentions how LBJ came from Texas and he was very racist in the 40s and everything. And once the civil rights era took off, he kind of did this pivot where he's like very supportive of civil rights for Black people, and kind of interesting to watch the choices politicians make at certain times in their career. But he ends up getting to this argument about what the Southern Democrats were doing specifically to manipulate these affirmative action laws, these New Deal era reforms that were intended to help people. So I'm going to look at page 22 and 23, where he's talking about the strategies that some of these. I want to go to page 11 first, because this is where he talks about the book itself. So page 11, he says, this book offers a second draft in the form of an extended commentary on the main themes and to fulfill these rights, which is the speech LBJ gave. How shall we understand the missed chance to fashion Black mobility and create a robust African-American middle class in the 2 decades after the Second World War? And what should we do to address the unequal powers of race even after the legislative work of the Civil Rights Revolution has been accomplished? These two questions can be connected by supplying the history President Johnson did not tell. 3 aspects define my reflections on why Black difficulty and disadvantage took root in the generation before the end of Jim Crow, and on how, in light of this history, the goal of broadly equal results across racial lines best can be advanced. The first and most fundamental is a historical account of the moment when affirmative action was white. The second is a line of argument about race and affirmative action. Third is an approach to policies. So he's sort of giving a different kind of outline for where the book's going to go. He's first going to talk about this history, about when white people benefited from it. Then he's going to talk about, race and affirmative action. And he's going to talk about what we can do today to actually make this stuff happen. So this first chapter is a deeper dive into when affirmative action was white. And so on page 22, I kind of want to read just through the strategy that Southern Democrats and other racist politicians were using to make sure that white people explicitly benefited from these reforms. And then we can kind of have a conversation about this chapter in general and go wherever you guys want to go. So in the middle of page 22 here, it says, the South's representatives built ramparts within the policy initiatives of the New Deal and the Fair Deal to safeguard their region's social organization. They accomplished this aim by making the most of their disproportionate numbers on committees, by their close acquaintance with legislative rules and procedures, and by exploiting the gap between the intensity of their feeling and the relative indifference of their fellow members of Congress. They used 3 mechanisms. First, whenever the nature of the legislation permitted, they sought to leave out as many African Americans as they could. They achieved this not by inscribing race into law, but by writing provisions that, in Robert Lieberman's language, were racially laden. The most important instances concerned categories of work in which Blacks were heavily overrepresented, notably farm workers and maids. These groups, constituting more than 60% of the Black labor force in the 1930s and nearly 75% of those who were employed in the South, were excluded from the legislation that created modern unions, from laws that set minimum wages and regulated the hours of work, and from Social Security until the 1950s. They successfully insisted that the administration of these and other laws, including assistance to the poor and support for veterans, be placed in the hands of local officials who were deeply hostile to Black aspirations. The bureaucrats who were handed authority by Congress used their capacity to shield the Southern system from challenge and disruption. Third, they prevented Congress from attaching any sort of anti-discrimination provisions to a wide array of social welfare programs, such as community health services, school lunches, and hospital construction grants, indeed all the programs that distributed monies to their region. As a consequence, at the very moment when a wide array of public policies was providing most white Americans valuable tools to advance their social welfare, ensure their old age, get good jobs, acquire economic security, build assets, and gain middle-class status, most Black Americans were left behind or left out. As a sort of summary of the strategies that were used to benefit white people with affirmative action, how do we feel about these tactics? If you want to talk any of them in particular, or them in general, or any reactions you have to this strategizing by Southern politicians.
I think one thing that kind of stuck out to me, and you hit it earlier, was basically how the Southern Democrats, and I was thinking about this as we were talking to you. We should probably explain at some point Southern Democrats and how the ideology between Democratic and Republican parties has shifted over the years. Some people might just not be aware of like Southern Democrats versus modern day Republicans versus modern day Democrats. And like we'll do, I think, an entire episode on like just American political systems and beliefs. But the thing that stuck out to me that you were talking about with the Southern Democrats, they were basically using their positions in high-ranking committees or as very senior members of Congress to kind of block certain policies or shape policies in ways that kept that social hierarchy that the South was used to in place. It might be of two things. One was just how Mitch McConnell, like when he was the leader of the Senate, would just block things, like anything that they didn't want to come through would just block it, right? Or how senior ranking committee members can just make sure things never make it out of committee, never make it to vote, right? Like just by holding certain positions. And the correlation to certain Republican leaders that run essentially unopposed, right? Like, and that was like a big part in that too, right? The Southern Democrats could just run unopposed for the most part. Actually, during that call that I had the other day in the Bernie thing, they said 55% of Republican seats run unopposed. So like that's an insane, like it's still occurring, right? Like they're still running unopposed in a lot of these places, right? So yeah, that's just
I
wanted
know
to
a
mention that 'cause-
Republican seat in a few years that's going to run unopposed. The executive. Nobody's allowed to run. That's really wild that that's
Yeah.
the case.
Yeah. And I mean, they were looking all across state politics and everything like that. But that's still like state politics is where that was the other piece that was just mentioned in there. Putting these policies in the hands of the states to control them that already have been dominated by a party that wants to go a certain way. Like you can pass whatever you want at the federal level, but if the people that are actually enacting those policies don't want to do it and you have no mechanism there, what effectiveness does that policy actually have, right?
Yeah, and it's wild that it happens in Congress and that, again, it's like, you know, maybe proportional representation would be more accurate. Why are these, you know, handful or dozen Southern Democrats at this time holding so much power? And I looked into it too about some of these things just to like highlight exactly what they were doing around the Social Security Act, you know, which, I mean, everybody in America right now loves Social Security. And it's like, you know, hands off like that. Like, it's for such a movement already, like don't touch my retirement fund that I paid for. But at the time, yeah, 65% of Black workers were ineligible at the time of passage. And then with the National Labor's Relation Act, only 6% of Black people were in unions at the time, when it was about like 20% of white people. And that Fair Labor Standards Act that you mentioned that included maids, it was like 75% of Black women were excluded from the domestic jobs that were included in the setting minimum wages and work hours and all this stuff. So I think, yeah, the whole point of it, like we have to stop telling ourselves this myth of white people pull themselves up by their bootstraps and it's all merit-based, and Black people, they just get left behind because they're just not, insert whatever you want there.
Yeah, that's wild too. Just like the insidiousness of the language in the laws, like the manipulation. Like he was saying, you don't have to specifically say Black people are excluded. But if you exclude all farm workers and all maids, you know you're excluding the vast majority of Black workers. And it's obvious when you look at the history that that's what they were doing. They don't need to explicitly come out and say it like that. Really, really wild stuff.
The lawfare
also
just
just
never
thinking-
ended.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I was thinking of progress in these moments when things happen, like the end of slavery, for example. Why is Juneteenth a holiday? Juneteenth is an example of this happening. I've just looked at the Wikipedia to confirm or whatever, but the 13th Amendment that officially ended slavery was passed in January 1865. Federal troops had to go to Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, some 6 months later, to let them know they were free because nobody told them. I mean, that's what Juneteenth is about, is that even after the law gets passed, the people who control your local area, they don't give a shit. They're going to keep doing what they want to do until someone forces them to do otherwise. And that's what Juneteenth is about. So it's just another example of how you can have a law passed that symbolizes progress, but in the day-to-day actual lives of people, it may not be true where you're at, depending on what circumstances you're in. Maybe before jumping to chapter 2, anything we want to say as white guys about this history? Is it important for white people to learn this history, to study what's actually going on with affirmative action? What can we say to our fellow whites to encourage them to read this history?
Yeah, I think it kind of bleeds into, Joe, you talking about acknowledging privilege. And I think, we're all born into our circumstance here in the US, which is kind of like, I'll make a bad trope again of saying it's like, what do they call it in Hunger Games? It's like zone 1 or whatever. It's not zone, it's district. We're in district 1,
Yeah,
baby.
gotta be in the district.
We're in District 1, and we're like that white blonde kid that they're choosing, and we're like, we just want to fight because we're the best. And it's like, we just have to, I don't know, the myths that we all tell ourselves, and it's like, it's just, it's a tool of like capitalism to perpetuate exactly what it wants, which is this. And it's like, if we actually just kind of acknowledge that we were all equal, maybe a different system would play out. So it's probably designed.
I guess like when I think about if I would try to encourage someone to read this, it's a difficult thing for me to answer just because I'm thinking through like, what would encourage somebody to read this? Well, like what would actually make somebody want to understand this history here? And I think it's like, what I'm struggling with is if I'm already really far on one side, like if I already believe that affirmative action is all that's doing is taking jobs away from people that might be more qualified. That's what's been put into my head my entire life, and that's how I'm relating to this. What would make me want to read this book? I think it's just like, how do you appeal to a desire to be better informed? How do you make people want to be better informed or want to understand the perspective of others when they're talking about this sort of thing? Like I'm trying to think through that and what would actually trigger somebody to be like, oh, I do want to understand that, like versus like, I'm just okay with whatever I was told. I don't know. It's a really difficult push, I guess. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree. It's a hard case to make sometimes, especially depending on what audience you imagine. They're all different kinds of white people, just like every other group. White people are not a monolith or whatever. But yeah, for me, I don't know. Have you guys, there's a meme I'm thinking of. It's really just a sound. Like, and whenever you think the government wouldn't do that, it's sort of implying that, yeah, they would. Yeah, they totally would. And I think this is an example of that. Would the government start this huge, vast federal program that's intended to benefit a subgroup that has been dispossessed of their ancestral homeland? They were stolen from Africa and brought to a totally different continent, removed from their cultural roots and have no connection to their historical family. Totally different language system, totally different lands to live on, totally removed from everything. We're going to have this law that tries to correct that vast injustice we did. Would the government use that cynically to actually benefit white people again? Yes, they would. And they did. And this is what that history is about. Part of it, I think, is just like waking people up to the fact that the notions you have about a lot of U.S. history are wrong. They're misinformed. They're intentionally manipulated to make you feel better about the way you view the world. And part of the struggle, I mean, I'm thinking about They Live now, and that scene where protagonist tries to force his friend to put the glasses on, and they're like literally fighting each other. It's like, it is really hard to snap people out of their comfortable worldview and to force them to see the side of reality that they don't want to acknowledge. And this is part of that, right? When we're talking to other white people, how do we convince them to put on the glasses?
Yeah. And actually, maybe I think you just outlined a better way for me to explain, I think, what I was thinking. But it's by looking at this just in the actions that were taken, you can see how, just like you said, Joe, like government can take something that sounds good on that high level, right? Like the sound bite, the media piece that you put out, like it can sound like a positive thing, but it can be manipulated on the back end, right? Or like how it's implemented. So maybe that's the pitch that I would use to somebody. Like if you read this book, then you can understand more about how that actually works, how small groups of people can have massive impact on what laws are implemented just by holding certain positions of power or understanding. They understand how government works. They understand how law works. and they can manipulate it to their benefit, right? Like, so we need to understand how that works. We need to understand like the tools that they've used from that point until now, both parties, whoever is in government, what tools they've used to manipulate how laws are actually implemented. Like, I think this book does a great job outlining that against, it's talking specifically how it was used against Black people and minorities, but it could be used against anyone, right? Like anyone that's in power, like they can do the same exact tactics, same exact tools against anyone. It will affect everybody, I guess is what I'm saying. So like if that's your disconnect from this, like you need to get over that because it's going to be used against everybody.
And it's not like a white guilt thing. I think people have like white guilt and it's really, they're really defensive about it. And I think that obviously that's tied into like identity of American myths and stuff. But yeah, I think it's like detaching them from that and then showing them how the system is rigged and providing historical context around, modern policies too. And like, when these bills get passed with hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, who are they excluding today?
Yeah.
And what effects will it have?
Totally.
And then what will we tell those generations, though? It's your fault.
Well, I was actually thinking when we were with Joe, when you were doing the preface and we were starting the first chapter and talking about how the New Deal started as this thing that was supposed to bring everybody up to the same level playing field, and it was manipulated. But how we're taught about it in schools is like the New Deal did. It brought Arthur, you said this right up front, like that's how we're taught. In 30 years, are we going to learn about the ACA and how it got more people, medical care and everything like that? And then there's going to be people talking about, well, wait a minute, but it didn't really do the thing that it was originally supposed to do, which is like there's no single payer option. It's a watered down Republican version of healthcare, right? Like, so it's the same thing happened with ACA. Like, it's not the optimal system. It's the one they got through because people would oppose anything better, right? Like, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Especially people representing health insurance industry.
Yeah. Definitely. I remember being like in high school, I was really into politics and history. And I remember being a little bit more naive, and I was just such a fanboy of FDR and the New Deal. I thought it was so cool that the guy spent all this money and the government came together and helped everybody. And I was like, we need another New Deal. And so uncovering it was just really disjoint. I don't know, but it was really interesting to learn about it.
And if you had New Deal 2, then would you be able to use what happened to the first one and be like, no, like we're going to watch out for this because it's going to happen, right? If you ever got somebody pushing like, let's actually push through the second Bill of Rights, then the same exact thing would play out and you would have to try and combat that in Congress and how they would try to water it down. But it also made me understand, like reading this and listening to this first portion more, like why that second Bill of Rights never got passed, because they didn't really get the New Deal in its original form through in the first place, right? So how are you going to get a second Bill of Rights passed when this one's so kneecapped, like before it even got through against those populations?
Yeah, totally. Just thinking of how we had mentioned ranked choice voting last time we talked, and then I don't remember which one of you sent it in the chat, but they're literally trying to prevent it from happening. Like, I think maybe we need to start a list of all the things that are obviously bad that Republican and Democratic parties fiercely agree on, because that list is like the target list of things that need to change.
That's your second Bill of Rights. Like every EO that comes out could be just like, oh, let's read through this one. Should we add that to the list? Yep, let's put it in there.
For chapter 2, what I really took away from this was, well, the phrase I wrote down in my notes was, okay, the title of the chapter he actually has is Welfare in Black and White. What I wrote down in my notes was how capitalists benefit from racism, because that's kind of the takeaway for me. Capitalists see an opportunity in every crisis. Every time we talked about the PPP loans for COVID and all this stuff, every time there's some big government program that's intended to help people, capitalists are rubbing their hands together trying to figure out how they can make it work for them. And you see these huge companies, I don't remember some of the names of the companies, but companies that got PPP loans. Like, did Target get one? There were some massive companies that are nowhere near to a small business that got some of these loans. And it's just kind of insane to see how it's a huge cash grab every time there's a huge federal program. It's a cash grab for corporations and special interests, and they'll do everything to manipulate the law to their benefit. So chapter 2 here it's talking about a lot of the specifics of how that happens, of the different work categories, the different wages people earn in different areas, why they're excluded. So there are a lot of statistics in this chapter. I kind of just want to read one short paragraph and then see what you guys want to talk about, or if you have parts in the chapter you want to go to and point out. This passage just kind of encapsulates, I feel like, the ethos of this strategy. So I'm on page 37, chapter 2, and Katznelson says, despite efforts by some Washington administrators, neither the size of benefits nor the pattern of distribution was standardized across the country. So they're putting different benefits out to different areas of the country. Although the Emergency Relief Act of 1933 furnished considerable powers to Harry Hopkins, the administrator of FERA, he soon discovered, quote, that he had to tailor relief to accommodate the demands of Southern plantation owners for cheap farm labor by curtailing the level of relief payments to agricultural laborers and sharecroppers, end quote. In other words, the law was manipulated to benefit plantation owners in the South, who themselves were descended from slave owners, because they want to keep these farm workers, who themselves are descended from enslaved people, back in the same positions that are basically the same material conditions as slavery, with very little changes. I thought that was just a nice sort of nail on the head moment for what's going on here.
It was a couple pages later, but I think it ties back into what we've been talking about as far as the control coming from capitalism and how policies were implemented in ways that could be exploited later. One of the things that was actually written down, I'm just going to read through this really quick because I think it's relevant here. I don't want to read the whole thing. Okay, well, I'm just going to read the part that like is the end of this, which is what I wanted to talk about. But basically, they're talking about to guard against certain outcomes that they didn't want to see. The key mechanism is deployed to separate the source of funding from the decisions about how to spend the money. So it's like basically taking like, okay, we can have this great policy again, right? Like that's put out at this level that says we have to do X, Y, Z. But if someone else who disagrees with the policy is the one that is in control of actually dispersing funds and like enacting that, then again, it has no teeth whatsoever because it's in the hands of local control that, you know, doesn't want to do that. And they're just not going to fund it. They're not going to release money for those programs. Just another mechanism of control for these things.
Totally.
Yeah, it's a very
states' rights.
It's a very data heavy chapter, and I highlighted some of them, wrote them down, and it was like in 1940, one black worker and 20 received unemployment benefits, and 8 out of 10 black workers in 1935 were excluded from Social Security. We already talked about Southern states refusing aid to black women altogether, specifically in domestic, what they call domestic jobs. It's surprising for the time, but not looking back on it, that they're never mentioning race or exclusions. They're just kind of using the job titles that they know they all have proportionately and then stating them. So it's kind of codified there. And it's, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you can draw a lot of parallels to today.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I mean, we're still living in a world where work defines you, right? And this whole thing about disability that I learned about last night, this other book I'd mentioned, disability as a concept only exists in relationship to a capitalist system, right? You're defined by your ability to be productive or not. Can you produce for the system or not? If you can't, oh, you're defective, you're disabled, you're mentally ill. Because, I mean, there are all kinds of mental syndromes that are made up historically and presently to keep people from having their perspective legitimized. Like, got that Trump derangement syndrome bullshit they're talking about now. 100 years ago, you had hysteria. If your wife was getting on your nerves, you could say she was hysterical and she would get locked up in an institution just because you said so. Like, this stuff has been, I mean, that's a little different from work per se. But yes, they can just use categories of work to define human beings, knowing that they're excluding specific types of human beings. So all maids, all home help workers, even though we know are like majority black, we're not going to say black. We're just going to say you can't include maids in this bill. And now black women don't get any help.
if you just think about it too, like, again, just separate out, just think this work role is not going to get the same amount of support for like any of these benefits, like the unemployment or anything like that. But these work roles at the time, like maids and farm workers, are probably the work roles that need those types of benefits the most. Like, so like, what's the justification for not include? Usually when you like exclude something, it's because, like, as an example, today, certain workers are excluded from like overtime, right? Because they are salaried positions and they make over a certain amount. So like they're excluded. That is also abused in other situations, but I'm just using that as a comparative, right? So if you're going to exclude somebody, then it's usually because you're already benefiting too much would be the right reason to exclude somebody or a certain thing. And in this one, it's the opposite. Like, it's just ridiculous. Joe, there was one other thing from chapter 2 that I wanted to comment on. It also ties right back to the capitalism critique here, but it was from Du Bois. It was a quote that he made. So I'm just going to read this real quick. All right. Real steady was, Du Bois also recognized that political arithmetic would block efforts by the president to advance black circumstances, even if he were to care deeply about their plight. Franklin Roosevelt has been hindered by the necessity of not going so far as to lose entirely the support of the South. Du Bois returned to this theme during Harry Truman's presidency, urging the Democrats to put out of business the Southern oligarchy and to work upon the liberal wing of the Democratic Party to impress upon the fact that the reactionary remnant of their party in the South has got to be displaced. So like, we're talking about oligarchy then, right? Like from this perspective.
Yeah. A part I highlighted was at the bottom of 39, where he kind of talks about how welfare programs were federally funded, but administered by states, which we kind of touched on. But he gave some concrete numbers, which I found pretty fascinating here. He writes that, federal transfers just paid 53% of the relief bill in Connecticut and 55% in New York. So that means that the other states are contributing the missing percentage. For instance, Connecticut, if it's 53, would be at 47, and New York at 55 would be paying 45% of the bill there for welfare programs. The federal cost covered 87% of the cost in Virginia, 95% in Alabama and Georgia, 98% in North Carolina, and nearly 100% in Florida. So 95% of welfare dollars federally go to Alabama. Alabama's providing 5%, and yet they as a state get to dictate and control where that aid is administered. They get massive federal subsidies for welfare from a federal level that come from all the states' tax dollars. And then they choose what to do with it, contributing 5%.
What I was thinking about was the present day parallel of, well, now we're going to start funding religious schools, right? In Oklahoma. Like, that's what they're trying to push through so that federal, I mean, that was Stephen Miller, what we just talked about,
Yeah.
right? And that thing was like, where's that federal money going to go? It's going to go to where the federal governments, or where they're aligning to those policies, right? And it's, yeah, our tax money from wherever we are going direct to fund those types of educations now.
And talking about like tax dollars, this is like off the cuff, but I'm certain that the majority of tax dollars have to come from the largest economies that we have in the US, and those would be California and New York, which are both heavily blue states, and those tax dollars are what are being distributed in this kind of same way.
I was just going to say, I think that gets us through chapter 2, unless there's any other major things we want to hit on that. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I think that was basically the wrap up. There was a paragraph on page 51, I thought, summarized nicely what he's trying to do to wrap this up. So yeah, just to wrap up this section, I said wrap up like 4 times in a row just now. Anyway, Ira Katznelson wraps up his argument and he said, when the New Deal began, the large majority of Black Americans living in the South lacked the civil and political rights of citizens. Ironically, they achieved some starkly limited social rights to relief and welfare even before the battle against Jim Crow had made significant gains. But it was the absence of citizenship rights that radically curtailed these improvements. Barred from the South's political system by a wide array of exclusionary rules and practices, they could secure no effectual political presence either at home or in Washington. Without Black political participation, Southern representatives in the House of Representatives and the Senate were utterly free not just to impede, but vetoed the full and fair participation of African Americans in the most important welfare-oriented advances of the 1930s. Black and white Southerners stood across a great political divide. Blacks could not achieve civic and political inclusion. They lacked recognition as citizens. They had no standing within the polity. Even their physical presence in the public sphere was limited to specific racially designated zones. So that last part is another way of saying apartheid. And it's important to note that during Jim Crow, during all of this stuff that Katznelson is pointing out, where the federal dollars are being used to benefit white people specifically, not just were Black people excluded, but they were also having to navigate this Jim Crow system of just complete separation and no participation in the government, no representation, like just how insanely disrespectful on a day-to-day level it has to feel to walk around in a world like that as a Black person. So I thought that was a part we could end on as a reflection. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.